Who knows? Okay, so we are so privileged and looking forward to this conversation that's about to unfold, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our colleagues. Professor Grace A. Musila teaches in the Department of African Literature at the University of the Witwatersrand. She is the editor of the Routledge Handbook for African Popular Culture, 2022, and Wangari Maathai's Registers of Freedom, 2020. She's also the author of A Death Retold in Truth and Rumor, Kenya, Britain, and the Julie Ward Murder, 2015. And she co-edited a very influential collection of essays called Rethinking Eastern African Intellectual Landscapes in 2012, together with our colleagues, Professors James Ugude and Dina Ligaga, who are known to many. And I have to say, she's also a colleague and a friend who keeps you on the straight and narrow. I've learned so much from Grace over the many years, and yeah, it's wonderful to have you here, Grace. She's in conversation with Tsitsi Dangarembga. Tsitsi Dangarembga was born in 1959 in Mutoko in present-day northeastern Zimbabwe. She's one of the most important writers, playwrights, and filmmakers in her country. She has been pioneering African forms of narrative in filmmaking through the annually held Equal Voices Story and Script Development Workshops, which are held in locations across the continent. Her internationally successful trilogy of novels tells the story of a young woman striving for self-determination in post-colonial Zimbabwe and illustrates the complex mechanisms of oppression associated with gender, colonialism, and racism. In 2018, her debut novel, Nervous Conditions, which was published in 1988, was included by the BBC on its list of the 100 most important books that have shaped the world. The 1993 film Neria is based on one of her stories and counts among the most popular films in Zimbabwe. Her latest novel, This Mournable Body, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And her most recent publication is a collection of essays called Black and Female. It's also available on the book table. In addition to her work as an author and filmmaker, Tsitsi has been an advocate for women's rights and political change in Zimbabwe. She received the PEN Pinter Prize, as well as the PEN International Award for Freedom of Expression, which honors authors who continue their writing despite facing persecution. Her other prizes include the 2021 Peace Prize of the German Book Trade and the Wyndham Campbell Prize for Fiction in 2022. Her various fellowships include a STIAS residency in 2021, a Radcliffe Fellowship at Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study in 22 to 23. She's also an honorary fellow of the Sydney Sussex College of Cambridge, and currently she is a Vico fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, where she's working on 5 projects across 3 disciplines. She holds an honorary D.Lit from Rhodes University, recognizing her for her significant contribution to African literature, cinema, and advocacy for social justice, gender equality, and freedom of expression. Please welcome our conversationalists.
Thank you so much, Tina, for that introduction. And again, a big thank you to the conveners, Tina, Maria, Louise, Prof. Gurna, and the entire STIAS and Nobel Foundation team behind this event. I think for writers, this might be usual, you encountering each other at this scale at festivals and all that. But for academics, at least for me, we don't get to spend time with writers at this scale in one space. We're lucky if we get to have you at a conference like 2 or 3 writers. So it's it's such a feast to be in the same space and for this long with you. So I really am grateful for the opportunity, and it's a great honor to be in conversation with you, Tsitsi. So I think, so what we'll do is we'll have a bit of a conversation, and then we'll spare some time at the end for an engagement with questions from the audience. So perhaps my first question will pick up from a thread that's been coming up from the first day, which is different writers' relationship to writing. And I think right from day one, it's a question that's been coming up. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us about what is writing to you, and to what extent has your relationship to it or the meaning of writing for you changed over the years?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much for that question, Grace. And before I attempt to answer it, just to say thank you to STIAS for inviting me back here. It's really wonderful to be back in this wonderful setting. Thank you also to the Swedish Academy, because without them, this gathering would not have taken place, and I would not have had the absolute pleasure, delight, and honor of meeting two Nobel laureates. So thank you so much. And also, I would not have had the pleasure of meeting all the other wonderful colleagues here who are helping me so much in my work, even in this short time that we have together. Thank you, Tina, for that lovely introduction. I would just like to say, though, to STIAS, you might have seen me talking to the wonderful people at the back there and asking them why they're giving me pink mouthpieces. So if you could please organize to have some diverse mouthpieces in future, because people are taking photographs and it's going to look really weird. Right, so your question about what is writing to me, you know, those kinds of academic questions are questions I struggle to answer, because I entered writing as an alternate opportunity, an alternative to academia, because at the time that I began my work in this area, the scope that was available to me was very constrained. That was back at the end of the 70s, actually, when I was having to make these decisions. And there's a line in Nervous Conditions, which is my first novel, in which Tambudzai, the protagonist, a young girl, comes into an environment where she begins to see the operation of patriarchy. Before, she had been exposed to poverty, so she moves into a new environment where she is exposed to patriarchy. And she says, I did not want to be predicted by such improper relations. So that was very much what I was experiencing as I observed academia, especially after having been admitted to the University of Cambridge to study medicine. I realized that I did not want to be predicted by such relationships. So this means I haven't really developed that analytical way of thought of academia, of definition, and of partitioning, and excising, confining, describing little bits, which I'm really happy that you do it, because when I do my work, I have to go to your work. So thank you very much. But for me, the whole issue of what I do, and I'm not even sure that I think of it as writing, I think of it more as speaking, because my writing began with an oral tradition, which was listening first to my grandmother. In fact, my mother told me one story orally, and I remember that story, and I know that I asked her to tell it to me again, and she never did. It was a once-off thing, and that was that. But then I got into this circumstance where in the rural home, we would have storytelling sessions. And there was one particular cousin, a male cousin who was older. He would gather us all around and would tell us stories every time that all the cousins were together. So I come from that kind of tradition. And I actually started off in theater, I think because of that. And I ended up writing prose when I realized that there was no scope for me to pursue theatre in Zimbabwe at the time, which was the early 80s. So for me, writing is really about finding a way to express what seems to be inexpressible about experience. You know, that is what I am constantly trying to do. I think, well, I know that there are times when I have experiences where I think I have no words for this. And so that becomes a challenge for me to go back and find a way to articulate it. So that is what writing is for me. It's a process. It is something that goes beyond this moment that is now to say, if I understand this moment better, what could be then? So I think of it also as a process of construction. And that construction necessarily requires excavation, and a very deep excavation. I find that it involves me in a lot of detours, a lot of circling, a lot of spiraling. And people have commented on why it takes me so long to write anything, and I think now you know why.
And I promise that wasn't attempting to be an academic question, or the stereotypical academic. It's probably I didn't phrase it as I should have, but I was curious about what the impulse to create, like, and we'll come to your other modes, the other modes in which you create, but also because you talk a bit in your autobiography, in one of the essays, you talk about writing as healing. And I'm wondering whether that's something, would you like to just say something about that while we're on the question of writing and creation, basically, creativity is a mode of healing?
Yeah. When I say something like that, or I write something like that, I am thinking about a present that presents itself to us in the way that it does. But this is just a present that is a part of what we call time. You know, we have imagined that this revolution that we say is 24 hours long is a day that is 24 hours long, but seen from other perspectives, I mean, what is an hour? It doesn't even exist. Okay, so I'm imagining that we're in this particular thing that we have said is time, and we then attribute time to the whole of creation and the universe or whatever, in the way we do as human beings. And I'm thinking that in this moment of time, things look like this. How do they look to us? Is there anything that we can do that transcends time, that can make it look different in a way that maybe makes it more bearable when it is unbearable? Yeah, so that is the sense in which I think of writing as healing. But there you see again all of this excavation and all the other things I spoke about. Yeah.
And just the power of the imagination to create and to just widen the horizon of what is possible.
Yeah, you know, I'm really sorry about this, but I'm getting to the point where I think, okay, we talk about imagination, but what is imagination? It is, again, something that we have said exists outside of certain other things, and there are boundaries. And, you know, if you look into other cultures and other ways of being, there is not this strict boundary. There is so much more fluidity. People can slip into one state from the other as necessary, but they are all part of the whole. Yeah.
And would you say your relationship to that, just that creative energy, or working with the creative imagination, how has it shifted over the years?
I think I'm much more aware of what I'm doing now. Before, I would just see something that would trigger that process, and I would go for it, which is not to say that it was a speedy process at all, but I would enter into the process without much reflection. Now I'm much more aware of what I'm doing and what the results of what I'm doing might be. So I do think a lot more about what I'm doing And I do think a lot more about the impact of what I'm doing and the responsibility that I personally want to embody. Not that I say that a writer should have a responsibility, but I personally, maybe because of my biography, I have a certain way of looking at the world and looking at myself in the world and thinking what that relationship of myself to the world should be. And I try to make that a reality in my writing. So as a young writer, when I began, when I was in my early 20s in newly independent Zimbabwe, it was for me looking at the situation of young women in particular and thinking about how can I communicate with them about what's coming. I could see that the kind of life that we knew growing up was disappearing fast. And in fact, people in Zimbabwe tell me that, especially my first book, is a means of dialogue in families now, because children will read it and then ask their parents, was it really like that when you were growing up? So it kind of promotes that kind of understanding between generations. So that was a very small idea that I had at that time. But now Zimbabwe has also progressed, and I have progressed in my understanding to the point where I realized that what was so salient for me as a young woman was simply a part of something that is much bigger. And so I think to myself, how can I now address that bigger thing with the particularities that I have? So I think it's a question of scope that is changing, but not so much of orientation.
And it's interesting that part of what you're also speaking to is the idea that nervous conditions almost functions as a kind of archive, because the idea of archive has been coming up a lot in our conversations. And you talk about it in the context of Zimbabwe, but for me as a Kenyan reader, there was so much in that novel that was recognizable. And of course, you're aware this panel was initially going to be on tomorrow on recognition. So for me, it was interesting to just think about the recognizability of what you tell us about nervous conditions, because it's about a certain moment in class formation across the continent, not just specific to Zimbabwe, and how you're able to breathe life to that, into that is just recognizable for many of us. So staying with the fiction, you chose to work with the trilogy format for the fiction, and I'm wondering what informed that choice?
Yeah, well, it was something that I'm quite ashamed of, really, because after Nervous Conditions was eventually published several years after I'd written it, my publisher was she was the commissioning editor at the Women's Press in London, and her name is Ros de Lannerol, and she was a South African in exile at that time. And I really think that that was a wonderful confluence of events, because I do believe that if she had not been a South African woman in exile in a position of power with respect to what narratives can be produced and distributed to a wider audience, Nervous Conditions would not have been published, because it had been rejected in Zimbabwe by the predominantly young black male editors at the time. So yes, it was very important for me that there was somebody there who could recognize that story. And so please repeat what else you were saying there.
The choice to work with the trilogy format as opposed to three different novels.
Yes, and so, yeah. Ros said to me, okay, Tsitsi, now we're publishing this book, but it's quite a while after you've written it, so you should have another book coming out soon. And I had just enrolled in film school because I had thought there was not going to be any point in my trying to pursue writing. So I was on my way to Berlin to learn how to make films. And I passed through London on the way and spent some time with her. So I said, okay, Ros, I will write something for you. She said, you know, I have a feeling that this book is going to do really well, so please write a sequel. So I said, okay, Ros, I will write a sequel. And then I became, I became immersed in learning how to make films, which was such a different kind of narrative that I wasn't able to write at that time. And then she passed away. So then I started feeling guilty. And I thought, oh my goodness, I promised her I will write it, so let me do that. So then something else happened, and this is how my life works. Things happen to ensure that I do the things that I'm meant to do. Zimbabwe then had its so-called land reform at the beginning of this millennium, and that was an atrocity, as well as I'm sure that many of you know. The stated intention of it was, of course, absolutely fabulous, and so everybody was on board with that. But then the way it was actually carried out was very regrettable, using some of the tactics of the liberation struggle. And so that's when I realized that the issues that had been building up in nervous conditions had not been resolved. I had thought that they had been resolved with independence and the kinds of speeches that we were having at that time. And so I thought that it was an appropriate time to tackle the sequel. So I did that, yeah. And then, of course, I realized that 2 books don't really work. And there was the issue of what was going to happen to the characters. My feminism was informed by African American feminism. And one of the tenets is that you have to stay alive. Now, concerning the characters, the 2 key characters in nervous conditions, one of them ends up very ill, and the other one begins to go the same way in the Book of Not. So I thought to myself, I have to rescue these people. And I remember talking to people who had read Nervous Conditions, and they would say to me, this character's going to die. There is no way that she can survive. So it just became a matter of obstinacy for me to say, no, she's going to survive, and she is going to live a livable life. So that's how it all happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And while we are with the characters, so most readers focus on the 2 major ones, and to a certain extent, Bamukuru. But I'm curious about Tambudzai's mother, and I wonder whether you could talk a bit about her as one of those minor characters who is also such a tragic figure in herself, and just if you could talk to us a bit about your sense of her as a tragic figure across the narrative.
Yeah, so Tambudzai's mother is a rural woman. She is an impoverished rural woman, and she has a never-do-well husband. And so she is really in one of the most awful situations in life. She watches 2 sons pass on, and there is absolutely nothing she can do. Now she has this girl, Tambudzai, and she obviously identifies with her daughter, but her daughter is desperate to leave the village behind. And so she has to watch her daughter leaving her as well. So basically what I'm saying with a character like Mashingai is that this is a person who is so constructed by the powers that do construct us to be in almost an ultimate situation of deprived agency. The one thing she does try to do is to raise fees so that her son can go to school. And she more or less succeeds in that, because then a relative from a wealthier section of the family realizes that the boy has potential and takes him away to a mission for further education after his primary school. But then the son dies. So even that little bit of effort that she has been able to muster in order to make sure that her son can get to this point of being recognized has this negative effect. So you know, we talk about things like resilience as though human beings are born to be resilient. You know, if you look at the constitutions of some countries, they tell us we are born to be happy. We can debate that, but I would also debate that human beings are born to be resilient. And so that is something I really wanted to question, and something that I continue to question, and it's becoming a big issue in African feminism as well. The extent to which being resilient is a desirable trait in human beings. I mean, I remember now quoting a film, 12 Years a Slave, where there is this slave woman who has been, or rather an enslaved woman who has been separated from her children. She's just been taken from one enslaver to another. So she arrives, and this particular enslaver is represented by a white woman who meets her as she arrives. And this woman is crying, and she will not cooperate. And so the woman asks the person who has made this, who has brought the enslaved woman there, so what's the matter with her? And so he says she is grieving for her children. And the woman responds, just give her something to eat and she'll be okay. You know, so this, so for me, this is something that really encapsulates the negative side of resilience. You know, you just give a person of this nature the basics of what is needed to keep body and soul together, and they will be all right and available for you to exploit and extract from in the way that you want. So I really wanted to make that case with my Shingai to say that actually it may look as though we are making progress, but until we have made progress for that kind of person, we cannot really say that we have made human progress. We might have made some other kinds of progress, like we might have made progress in spreading the structures of Europe and its descendant state civilization to other parts of the world. We might have made progress in that. But how much of humanity does that actually encompass when you do the math and the figures? It's not that great an amount of humanity who are encompassed in that kind of progress.
No, and I think for me, she stays with me because of how powerfully you shape her, and how, because theoretically she should be happy and grateful that at least her daughter is, you know, on her way somewhere and all that, but you nail her bitterness and her anger and that hostility, the intimate hostility. We're talking about intimacy earlier. There's a certain just intimate resentment between mother-daughter that you really capture beautifully there. So, and she's always stayed with me. So you work in...
Sorry, just a little more on that. So in terms of rehabilitating my characters, Tambuzai's journey has to be going back to recognize the humanity of her own mother, which is what happens in this mournable body.
Yes, and just that coming full circle.
Right.
No, it's beautiful, and just it stays with at least it stays with me as a reader. And since we mentioned film earlier, my sense of your work is that you work in these different modes as well as different technologies, for lack of a better term, as well as different genres. So you work with fiction, you work with autobiography, and you also work with film. And within film, you do both feature films and documentary filmmaking. And so what's the appeal of these different forms? What are the affordances that they give you?
Yeah, well, you know, I also started thinking about film in my 20s when I was quite new to narrative. And for me, it was all about doing. You know, for me, writing was doing because I had a clear vision of how the written would have some impact in the real world. So it was about doing. And then because Nervous Conditions wasn't published for a number of years after I wrote it, I thought, well, I will try to find another narrative form that I can use. And I decided on film because I could see that that was a form that was going to become more and more popular. So the question was how to actually get an education in film. And I can remember thinking this through and thinking, well, I can't go to the UK, that's much too expensive for me. Can't go to the USA for the same reason. But wait, I've heard that there's a really great school in Havana, and let me try to get there. So I went down to the Cuban embassy in Harare and knocked on the door and said, oh, I've come here because I want you to help me to get to film school in Havana. And I remember it was this huge white Cuban man, and he said, what? I repeated. He said, okay, stay here. So I waited, then he came back with these two other big white Cuban men. And he said, this girl has come here and said she wants to go to film school in Havana. And then they started laughing. So that was the end of that. That must have been like in the mid-'80s or something. But at the time, a friend of mine worked at the German volunteer service. Yes, the other place I had thought I could try was Australia, because Australia was making some interesting films at that time. But I don't even know whether we had an Australian embassy in Zimbabwe at that time. But I had no idea about them, so I just didn't do anything. But I had this friend who worked at what was called the German Volunteer Service. And I got to meet some of her people. And they said, well, look, there's this wonderful film school in Berlin, so why don't you go there? So I applied. And they had a two-phase process. And first of all, you did your written, and then you had to go for an entrance examination. And to my surprise, I actually got through the written. I hadn't expected to. These friends of mine had sat down and had translated my application into German. So then I had to find a way to get there for the exam, which I then managed to do again. People were just ever so helpful, giving me places to stay and this kind of thing. And the German system, in Berlin at least, it depends on which of the Länder that you are actually in. If you are not a mother tongue German speaker, they give you extra time to do your exams. So I did this 2-week German crash course in Harare, and I went with my dictionary, and I took it into the exams. And then they would keep coming in after everyone had finished, because you were allowed to go as soon as you finished. Have you finished yet? No, I haven't. Okay, And then they let me in, so that was amazing. But for me, it was just practical. I want to make narrative because I want to engage with people in that form. I think that's what I'm here to do. I can't write because they won't publish, so what's the next thing I can do? So that's how I got into film. So I actually started thinking about your question when I was in it, because that's when I came up against things that... When I think about them today, I still get re-traumatized. For example, one of the films that we had to watch as examples of the great trajectory of the medium was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. I hadn't heard about that film, because I was coming from the University of Zimbabwe, where I'd studied psychology, and I'd just been doing theater with my friends, etc. I'd never heard about that film. And so I sat there watching this, and I could just feel myself, becoming traumatized. And when I got out of there, I spoke to some of my friends, and they were shocked. What, you saw that film? And there was no caveat around it. No, they just presented it as this masterpiece, particularly of the editing. And then we had to see things like Nanook of the North. I mean, it was heavy. I was completely traumatized. So I, in fact, stopped going to lectures for a long time. And that's when I started teaching myself film theory, because I had to find out, why are they teaching me this in the way that they are teaching it to me? And that's when I began to understand what film can do, why there is such tight control over who can make films and who can make what kind of films, and what kind of films the, in quotation marks, natives should be fed. I mean, and you can see that ideology still permeating on the streamers. I mean, my goodness. The African productions that are on the streamers are frightening, just as frightening, but in a different way. Yeah, and so I ventured into this medium without any specific intention, but now my intention is very definitely to also, what can I say, to structure into film a different kind of consciousness than has been structured into it so far. I mean, many people are now working in that area, but again, because of the gatekeeping and most of the money is coming from Europe and its descendant states, I think we've already heard about Next Narrative, what is it, Next Narrative Africa, yeah, where they won't allow you to talk about war, never mind that, you know, so many of us have experiences of war as part of our formative experience. Yeah.
No, thank you. I love that, your turn of phrase there, structuring into film a new consciousness. And then what about autobiography? Why?
Yeah, well, again, it was because of my process. I hadn't had an agent in my life until this Booker nomination. Then I got an agent, and this agent was known for building careers. And so when I explained my situation and my process to her, it was something like, well, that's not going to really work. So, you know, you have to do something simpler that you can do more quickly. So I said, well, yeah, I'm not really averse to that because I also need to eat and to feed my children and to send them to school. So what do you suggest? Then she said, well, I had this other client who was in a kind of similar situation to yours. And so she wrote a short autobiographical collection of essays. Would you like to do that? So I said, yes, I'll do it. That's what happened.
How it comes about.
And I wrote this at STIAS, actually. Yes, amazing. It happened in like 5 months. I know, and yeah, I wrote it at STIAS. I'm eternally grateful to STIAS. But, you know, I barely had to even think about it. I just wrote it. I was working on something else at STIAS at the time. You know, I will love STIAS forever because, no, seriously, the application I wrote was so awful. And it was something about the subjectivity of the Shona subject in relation to whatever. I'm so glad I can't. I am so glad that I can't even remember it. I don't want to remember it. But someone at STIAS read that with a straight face and said, okay, we'll let her come. Yeah, and so that's how this happened. It really was because of STIAS. Yeah.
Well, it came together very, you know.
Yeah, I think it was the environment at STIAS was very helpful. So at dinner yesterday, I could really relate to what they were saying. And I came in, I was the immediate post-COVID cohort. I think we were the first after lockdown. And so we were meant to come, at least my cohort was meant to come in 2020, but that's when we had the lockdown. So they then said we should come in January 21. And I think it was a question of if you feel you would like to come, since we are still in the pandemic. There were very few of us here, maybe about 15 people. So they were like die-hard Africanists or really concerned about Africa and the South. And so it was really just like the best situation for me to be in to start doing that kind of work. Yeah.
And I have many more questions, but I don't want to be greedy and hold you. So I'll hog you rather. So I'll just have one last question, which is, what are you working on right now?
Yeah. Well, you know, I live in Zimbabwe. I'm actually based in Zimbabwe, but life there is very tricky for everyone. And it's also tricky for people who've had any kind of brush with the state, which I did have in 2020. So again, that's why STIAS was really a lifesaver. It meant I could leave that situation and come here. I was actually on bail, reporting once a week at the time. So my lawyers had to make a special request for the bail conditions to be lifted. And I am told that the woman who actually allowed me to come here and said, this fellowship is a lifetime chance for your career, and the charges against you are not serious, so I'm lifting your bail conditions. I hear that she was due for promotion and was overlooked. Yeah, that's Zimbabwe for you. So, I came here and I wrote that, but then I had to keep on producing, but I had to try to keep the things that I do in Zimbabwe, which is basically the Institute of Creative Arts for Progress in Africa, which focuses on women's narrative in various areas, including film. We started a festival where we also had visual arts and literature, but now, because of complications with funding and that kind of thing, we've reduced it to film. And for the last editions, we had to reduce it to films that did not charge a screening fee, because we couldn't pay screening fees, but we're still continuing anyway. So I had to keep all that going. I have about 8 people that we employ, the majority of them young women, and then at festival time, we get up to 40 other people, so I have a responsibility to them. But I couldn't stay in the country, so now I have to find work that takes me out of the country. So I'm actually at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin at the moment, and I'll be there until the middle of next year. And this is where I'm doing the 5 projects that I can't do when I'm managing the institute and the festival in Harare. So one of them is born out of my experience with film, which mirrored the experience I had with prose writing, but also magnified it. The degree of exclusion it's of certain representations of certain groups of people, and definitely African women is glaring. So I am looking for a way to quantify that, first of all, and then to turn the idea of absence into a quantity in itself, so that you are not saying they are almost never seen. You are saying something like there is 80% of not being seenness. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. Bhakti is helping me with that project. And just this week, Ashley has been invaluable. So I'm really excited now. Then I have a couple of film scripts that I've been working on for some time. It really is a question of structure. And I think that structure can more easily be, I don't really want to use the word subverted, and I don't even want to use the word accommodated, but it can more easily be included within what we recognize as a novel. Because a novel in itself, it's not a very tight kind of structure. But now with film, you have to tell your story visually. So we are already into the language of looks, what we see. And then it's only 90 minutes. So you have to inscribe a universe into 90 minutes. Now, if you're thinking of making a film that you want many people to see, who are the many people who are able to watch film sort of in the various technologies that we have? We had that question that Khabeba asked about digital archives. Okay, and somebody said, well, most people don't have access to that anyway. And I would probably say it's most people in the world. Well, maybe not most people in the world, but a very large number, and definitely inordinately so in the global south. So what worlds are familiar in film that when people begin to watch them, they can orientate themselves? You know, so you're starting from such a huge disadvantage. So it takes a huge amount of rewriting a script, and you have to have people who really understand this problematic, who understand the world that you want to now inscribe into this visual medium of moving images, so that you don't end up doing something that is not really you and not really what you wanted to say, which is what we see a lot of. I often compare the situation that we're in with respect to moving images, and especially now that the actual technology of it is so available, to Phyllis Wheatley and her poems about her long blonde hair. I think that we're in a similar moment, and we have to find ways to go beyond that now. I think there is a consciousness awakening, but the gatekeeping is absolute legion. You wouldn't believe it. So it's a huge battle. So I've been refining these scripts. One of them is actually an adaptation of a South African novel called The Thunder That Roars, and it's about a young woman from KwaZulu-Natal who goes to Johannesburg to work in a family of Asian heritage. As a young girl, the man of the house has a relationship with her. I'm not quite sure whether she has a relationship with him, but he has one with her, and a child is born. And this child is raised not knowing who his mother is, thinking that the man's wife is his mother, and she is just the maid. And so my take on this story is the story of how this woman actually is able eventually to have the agency to build a relationship with her son. And so for me, this is such a powerful story, and it is something that reflects the reality of so many people whose mothers from the South are in this kind of labor. But I'm told it's kind of like this next narrative Africa moment that nobody's going to be interested in a domestic worker.
No.
Yeah. Yes. I know these are the kinds of psychological barriers that have been built into film. You know, so I have to argue that I can show this character not as a domestic worker, but as a mother who is in a particular position. And that should be able to speak to any mother out there. And it should also be able to speak to any child who has had any problem with their mother. You know, and then this takes place sort of peri-South African independence, so the racial issues, which are now again becoming so topical with the fascist turn in Europe and its descendant states, as well as others. Okay, so it's not just Europe this time. But, you know, these stories are not being told. So this is really the area that I'm operating in, so I'm persisting with that as well. You can't get funding. There is absolutely no development money for African films, apart from maybe the Hubert Bals Fund, which will do something like 10,000. 10,000 euros will pay your dramaturg for maybe two versions, 2 drafts. That's what 10,000 will pay, and that's what's on the table. Yeah, so that's the situation. This is why I talk about the structure of gatekeeping to film as being one of the last bastions of this crumbling civilization that we are now in. But I feel it's really important to get the diversity of voices in there, because as one thing declines, something else has to be built. Absolutely. And so we have to be very conscious of what we are enabling to be built by giving people the mental and psychological resources to imagine something that has not been before. Yeah. So then I have a novel that I'm doing and a nonfiction that are actually bringing to fruition what began as that awful travesty here in STIAS. So I'm hoping that I will do STIAS justice with those in the end. It began with this idea of the Shona subject because so many terrible things were happening in Zimbabwe. I said to myself, you know, we as people who speak this language called Shona do not identify as Shona people anyway. I mean, we have other ways of identifying. So I wanted to know who we are, where we came from, why we are the way we are, specifically these people on the plateau, why do we behave in the way that we do? And it was so discouraging that I thought, is there nothing that we can bring to today's table? So I'm thinking of a reworking of UNU, known more popularly, of course, as Ubuntu, into something that is applicable in a more contemporary setting. And I'm trying to write that in non-fiction and also in fiction. Yeah.
Oh gosh, this is an exciting range of projects.
Yeah. We've got to get them done before I go back to Zimbabwe. Yeah.
Well, no, please join me in thanking Tsitsi for this. Thank you so much. Tina, I don't know, we've got 3 or so minutes.
Oh,
so I don't know if there's a burning question, or are we okay to continue during tea? Or can you, Tina, talk to me?
Yeah, we can cut into tea a little bit.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take maybe one round. So okay, so let's see what the questions are. So we've got Ida, we've got Jennifer. Okay, and we've got Aminata in that order. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much, both of you. This was brilliant. Mine is very, very quickly. I just want to know, having heard you say about the non-Shona identity, I'm interested in your thoughts on your translations into Shona by Mubasa and them, as in like, what's your role in that, and how do you view those translations? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So to Jennifer, please. Oh,
Thank you very much for the clarifications or the questions I had about your 3 novels. You know, you answered them. Thank you very much. But then you said something that goes that I have not developed, I had not developed in the way of excising, analyzing, and petitioning of academia. Remember that? That's,
Okay, tell me again what I said, please, Jennifer.
oh God, and my mind is as bad as yours. You had it better, but you were talking about having not studied literature. I remember you said you didn't study it at. This was between the two of us, but you didn't study it at A level. You did it at O levels, but you didn't do it at A level. You didn't do it at university, and you went in for medicine. So, and there was this sense that you. Because of that, you didn't develop this excising and analyzing and petitioning, yes?
All right.
Yeah, so my question is, do you think that had you gone on that trajectory and did literature, that your writing would be different? The reason I'm asking this is, so when I finished doing creative writing and I wanted to do a PhD, I wanted to do a critical one. And my supervisor kept on saying, Jennifer, don't go that way. Don't do a critical literature. It won't be good for your writing. I went ahead and did half and half. But I just wonder, do you, when you look back, do you think you'd have written differently?
Jennifer has touched on my question, and mine is, I also didn't study literature at university, but I did become a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and I was interested in asking you about craft, because we haven't really talked much about craft this week, and I would like to ask you, in what you've touched on the challenges of making film as opposed to writing a novel, but I would like to know, hear you talk about the ways in which knowledge of one craft enhances and informs the other. Thank you.
beautiful questions.
I mean filmmaking and prose writing, obviously.
Okay, so Ida, thank you so much for that question. And you had this wonderful phrase that I actually wrote down, but I can't find it now, about what you do as a translator in repatriating these stories. So it was a kind of similar situation with me, again, roundabout, all sorts of events coming together. My good friend Ignatius Mabasa was a Fulbright scholar in the 90s, I think, and it was at that point already that he came to me because he was teaching nervous conditions, but he had nothing to tell them about Shona language literature. And so he began to realize the lack. And he came to me and said, Tsitsi, I want to translate this. I have got 3 chapters done already. I said to him, Mabasa, you know, I would love to have it translated also, but I don't know how I can pay you to get that done. So we had to park that project. So then in 2021, the German book trade generously awarded me their Peace Prize. So when I got back to Zimbabwe from that celebration, the German ambassador asked me to come to lunch, and I could invite whoever I wanted to have. Now, we had done one publication with our ICAPA Trust called A Family Portrait, and House of Books, which operates at the airports, and I think they might have another outlet in town, had now taken it from ICAPA Trust and done their own edition. So I thought to myself, this is fabulous. I invite Mabasa, I invite Dimitri, I put them at a table together, and at the end of the day, the German ambassador is there to provide the money, and so we will come out with a deal. So that's more or less what happened, except that the German ambassador did not provide the money, but it happened anyway. So that's how it got translated. It was something that was, both Ignatius and I wanted it so passionately, because he said, you know, although we have this literacy which is declining in Zimbabwe, for it really to come home to people, to the intended audience, it needs to be in the local language. And I can tell you that Mabasa, he's just amazing. And yeah, it's a brilliant translation, and I'm really happy. And I'm wondering whether this mournable body will be translated, and I think that that might be a bit more of a challenge in the current dispensation. Yeah, so we'll see. But the Book of Not is translated as well, and that is a bit critical, so maybe that will still happen. So I am all for that. It's just such a tragedy that the Department of African Languages, where Shona and Ndebele degrees were awarded, has now been discontinued at the University of Zimbabwe. I mean, yeah. So then coming to you, Jennifer, yes, most definitely. I think that if I had been instructed in the canon, I would have written in a more canonesque way. And I know that in terms of film, or I did some radio as well early on, just for my own writing. You know, I was thinking I would make these into radio plays, but I found myself writing romances. I'm so glad there was nobody there to publish them, you know, but then I went to university, as I said, just post-independence, and all that changed for the better. So definitely, I think the canon would have had an effect on me which would have been adverse for my purposes. Yeah. And so craft. You know, Aminata, I found that having been a novel writer was a huge impediment to becoming a screenwriter. And that's why it took me so long to honor my promise to Roz, because I had to park that to really get into the way of writing visually. In my Equal Voices workshops, I've had facilitators who split up the process into the story writing, which can be done in a kind of a prose style. And then you get to the end where you've got your treatment as a story. You then have to rewrite it in a different kind of prose for your film prose, but it's still the treatment. So I had to actually get away from that prose writing to understand how to do the film treatment writing. So from that view, it was a bit of an impediment. What I have seen is that making film has sharpened my observation, though. I come from a background that was very conservative, and so I found it difficult to look at people. Look people in the eye. It was something I learned to do when I went to Germany to study film at the end of my 20s, because that was rude in the culture I was socialized into. And I can really remember the times that I had to start looking at people. I would feel literally terrified. So I had a wonderful friend of mine who's still my friend, and we should be starting up a branch. In fact, we are starting up a branch of ICAPA in Nairobi now, where the filmmaker Wanjiru Kinyanjui. And I told her about this. I said, you know, what am I going to do? And I understand I have to be able to look because this is film. She said, look at their teeth. So that's how I began, with the teeth going up to the nose until I could look people in the eye.
Oh, that's beautiful. But you know you're in the canon, right? You're canonical.
Oh, you would know that. You know, I wouldn't.
I'm just breaking it to you.
Oh, thank you.
Please join me in thanking Tsitsi.
Thank you. Thank you for your